Alright, let's start with something that confuses a lot of people. Why does it feel like Chinese learners go from zero to fluent in English so fast?
Right? You meet someone and just months ago they barely spoke, then suddenly they're holding full conversations like they've been doing it for years.
Exactly, and it's not magic. There's actually a system behind it, several in fact.
And some of these secrets are things most English learners completely ignore.
Let's break the first myth. They don't actually learn faster because they're naturally better at languages.
Yes, this isn't about talent, it's about environment, strategy, and pressure.
Pressure is a big one. In China, English isn't just a subject, it's tied to opportunity.
Exactly, from school exams to job interviews, English can literally shape your future.
So the motivation is intense, and when motivation is high, learning speed increases.
But motivation alone isn't enough. The real secret starts with how they learn.
Let's talk about repetition. Chinese learners repeat things obsessively.
And not just repeating words, they repeat entire sentences, conversations, even accents.
It's called shadowing. You listen and speak at the same time as a native speaker.
Which feels awkward at first, but it rewires your brain incredibly fast.
Because you're not translating anymore, you're mimicking.
And that's the key difference. Most learners translate, Chinese learners imitate.
That alone can cut learning time in half.
Another thing, they don't wait to be perfect before speaking.
Oh yeah, they're willing to sound wrong a lot.
And that's uncomfortable for many people, but it's necessary.
There's actually a saying among learners, fluency comes from mistakes, not perfection.
And Chinese classrooms encourage that more than you'd expect.
Let's talk about classroom structure. It's intense.
Very intense, students often spend years memorizing vocabulary and grammar.
Some people criticize that method.
But here's the twist, it builds a massive foundation.
So when they finally start speaking, they already know a lot.
It's like loading a spring, then releasing it.
That's why progress suddenly looks fast.
But really, it's years of preparation showing up all at once.
Here's something fascinating. Many Chinese learners memorize entire dialogues.
Yes, not just words, full conversations.
So when they speak, they're not constructing sentences from scratch,
They're recalling patterns they've already practiced hundreds of times.
which makes their speech smoother and faster.
It's like having ready-made building blocks.
Another secret, they immerse themselves digitally.
Oh yes, apps, videos, podcasts, movies, all in English.
Even social media plays a role.
Some follow only English-speaking creators to force exposure.
That's a clever trick. Your environment shapes your thinking.
And when your environment is English, your brain adapts.
Let's not forget pronunciation training.
Huge point, Chinese learners often practice sounds very deliberately.
Because English sounds are very different from Mandarin.
So they train their mouths like athletes train muscles.
That's something most learners skip.
And then they wonder why they're not understood.
Here's a surprising fact. Many Chinese students wake up early just to practice English aloud.
Yes, morning reading sessions are very common.
There's something about speaking out loud that accelerates memory.
It engages more parts of the brain than silent reading.
Another strategy, they focus heavily on listening.
Because if you can't understand, you can't respond.
Makes sense, listening is the gateway to speaking.
And they expose themselves to different accents too,
British, American, Australian, you name it.
which makes them more adaptable in real conversations.
Let's talk about discipline.
Ah yes, the underrated superpower.
Discipline is where things really start to separate casual learners from serious ones.
Absolutely. In China, consistency is almost a cultural expectation when it comes to studying.
It's not about studying once in a while, it's daily structured effort.
Even 30 minutes a day, but done every single day, creates momentum.
And momentum in language learning is everything.
Because once you stop, you don't just pause, you actually slide backward.
Here's something interesting. Many Chinese learners track their progress very closely.
Yes, they measure vocabulary learned, hours practiced, even mistakes made.
That level of awareness helps them adjust quickly.
It turns learning into something almost like a game.
And speaking of games, gamified apps are huge.
Apps like Duolingo, but also Chinese-specific platforms that reward streaks and effort.
Rewards may seem small, but psychologically they keep you hooked.
And that's the goal, make learning addictive.
Let's talk about another underrated factor, peer competition.
Oh yes, students often compare scores, pronunciation, even fluency levels.
And instead of discouraging them, it pushes them harder.
It creates a subtle pressure to improve faster.
Now here's something many people overlook. They practice thinking in English.
That's a big one. Instead of translating thoughts, they start forming thoughts directly in English.
At first it's slow and awkward.
But eventually it becomes natural, like switching a mental language setting.
And that's when fluency really kicks in.
Because you remove the delay of translation.
Let's talk about mistakes again, but from a different angle.
You mean how they actually analyze their mistakes?
Exactly, they don't just move on, they revisit and correct.
Some even keep notebooks of common errors.
Which is incredibly effective.
Because patterns start to emerge, and once you see patterns, you can fix them.
Here's a surprising habit. Many learners record themselves speaking.
Yes, then they listen back and critique their own pronunciation.
It's uncomfortable but powerful.
Because you hear yourself the way others do.
Let's shift to input. The type of content they consume matters.
They often choose content slightly above their level.
Not too easy, not too hard, just challenging enough.
That's where growth happens.
It's called the comprehensible input zone.
And staying in that zone accelerates learning dramatically.
Another fascinating thing, they memorize chunks, not just words.
Write phrases like on the other hand or as a matter of fact.
These chunks make speech sound more natural.
And reduce the effort of building sentences from scratch.
Let's talk about teachers.
Many Chinese learners invest heavily in good instruction.
Whether online or offline, guidance matters.
Because a good teacher corrects mistakes early.
And prevents bad habits from forming.
Which saves time in the long run.
Here's something unexpected. They often exaggerate pronunciation while practicing.
Yes, almost like actors over-enunciating lines.
That exaggeration helps build muscle memory.
And later, it naturally softens into normal speech.
Let's talk about courage.
Because at some point, you have to actually speak to real people.
And that's where many learners freeze.
But Chinese learners often push through that fear.
Because they understand something crucial.
Fluency doesn't come from comfort, it comes from exposure.
Now we're getting into something deeper, the mindset behind the method.
Yes, because techniques matter, but mindset determines how long you stick with them.
And one thing that stands out is long-term thinking.
Exactly, many Chinese learners don't expect instant results.
They're willing to invest years into mastering English.
Which removes frustration when progress feels slow.
Because they already expect the process to take time.
And ironically, that patience makes them progress faster.
Here's another mindset shift. They treat English like a skill, not a subject.
That's huge. A subject is something you study, a skill is something you practice.
And skills require repetition, failure, and refinement.
Which changes how they approach learning completely.
Let's talk about identity.
You mean how they start seeing themselves as English speakers.
Exactly, even before they're fluent.
That identity shift builds confidence.
And confidence leads to more practice.
Which leads to faster improvement, a powerful loop.
Here's something subtle, they normalize struggle.
Yes, struggling isn't seen as failure, it's seen as progress.
So they don't quit when things get hard.
They lean into the difficulty.
Now let's talk about imitation again, but deeper.
They don't just imitate words, they imitate rhythm, tone, even personality.
Some learners copy their favorite actors or YouTubers,
Almost like they're borrowing a voice.
which helps them sound more natural.
And makes learning more fun.
Fun is actually an important factor here.
Definitely, the more enjoyable the process, the more consistent it becomes.
Let's talk about memorization again, because it's often misunderstood.
People think memorization is boring or outdated.
But when done right, it's incredibly powerful.
Especially when combined with usage.
So instead of memorizing and forgetting,
They memorize and immediately apply.
that reinforces the information quickly.
And turns passive knowledge into active skill.
Here's a fascinating trick. They simplify before they expand.
Meaning they start with basic structures and master them first.
Instead of trying to sound advanced too early.
Which prevents overwhelm.
And builds confidence step by step.
Confidence is like fuel in this process.
Let's talk about fear of judgment.
Because that stops a lot of learners.
Chinese learners often reduce this fear by practicing in safe environments first.
like language apps, classrooms, or speaking groups.
So by the time they face real conversations,
They're already somewhat prepared.
here's something interesting, they focus on communication, not perfection.
Meaning the goal is to be understood, not flawless.
That mindset speeds things up dramatically.
Because perfection slows you down.
Let's talk about curiosity.
Curiosity keeps the brain engaged,
And many learners stay curious about culture, slang, and expressions.
which makes the language feel alive.
Not just something in a textbook.
Exactly, it becomes part of their world.
Now we move into what really separates fast learners from everyone else, the advanced strategies.
This is where things get interesting, because these are habits most people never even think about.
Let's start with output balance. Many learners focus too much on input, listening, and reading.
But Chinese learners actively balance input with output, speaking and writing.
Because understanding something doesn't mean you can use it.
Exactly, you need to produce the language.
Here's a powerful technique: they retell stories.
Yes, they watch a video or read something, then explain it in their own words.
That forces the brain to organize thoughts in English.
And exposes gaps in vocabulary instantly.
Another advanced move, they limit their native language during practice,
Almost like creating a mini English-only zone.
which can feel uncomfortable.
But it forces faster adaptation.
Let's talk about speed training.
You mean speaking faster on purpose.
Exactly, some learners deliberately increase their speaking speed.
Even if it gets messy at first.
Because speed builds automaticity.
And automaticity leads to fluency.
Here's something surprising: they use translation strategically.
Not as a crutch, but as a tool.
For example, comparing sentence structures between Chinese and English.
Which helps them understand patterns more deeply.
Let's talk about vocabulary expansion.
They don't just learn random words, they learn high-frequency words first.
Words that appear most often in real conversations.
Which gives them faster, practical fluency.
Another trick, they group words by theme.
Like food, travel, business, emotions.
That makes recall easier during conversations.
Because the brain organizes information in clusters.
Here's a powerful habit: asking questions constantly.
Instead of staying silent, they engage more.
Questions keep conversations going.
And create more opportunities to practice.
Let's talk about feedback.
Fast learners seek correction instead of avoiding it.
Because correction equals improvement.
Even if it feels uncomfortable in the moment.
Here's something many people don't expect: they mimic emotion.
Yes, not just words, but how those words feel.
Anger, excitement, humor, they practice expressing all of it.
Which makes their speech more natural and engaging.
Let's talk about consistency again, but at a higher level.
Advanced learners don't rely on motivation, they rely on routine.
Because motivation comes and goes.
But routines stay.
Here's a fascinating insight: they embrace plateaus.
You mean when progress feels stuck?
Exactly, instead of quitting, they push through.
Because they understand growth is not always visible.
Let's talk about exposure to real conversations.
Movies are great, but real conversations are unpredictable.
And that unpredictability builds true fluency.
Because you have to think on your feet.
Here's a smart move: they revisit old material.
Instead of always chasing new content.
Repetition deepens understanding.
And strengthens memory over time.
So after everything we've explored, it's time to answer the big question: what's the real secret?
And the truth is, it's not just one thing. It's a combination of habits, mindset, and consistency.
Exactly, there's no shortcut, but there is a pattern.
A pattern of deliberate practice, daily exposure, and fearless communication.
Let's simplify it. If you had to compress everything into one idea,
It would be this: they don't just learn English, they live it.
that's powerful, because once a language becomes part of your daily life
It stops feeling like something foreign.
and starts feeling natural,
Here's something important: they don't wait for perfect conditions.
they start with what they have,
A phone, a notebook, a simple app, anything.
and they build from there.
That's a huge lesson for anyone learning a language.
Another key takeaway: they focus on progress, not comparison.
Because comparing yourself to others can slow you down.
But tracking your own growth keeps you motivated.
Even small improvements matter.
Let's talk about confidence one last time.
Confidence isn't something you wait for, it's something you build.
Through repetition, mistakes, and persistence.
And every conversation makes you a little better.
Here's the truth most people avoid.
Fluency is uncomfortable.
It requires you to feel awkward, uncertain, even embarrassed.
But that discomfort is the price of growth.
And Chinese learners, for the most part, accept that price.
Which is why they move forward faster.
Let's break the final illusion that they learn fast.
In reality, what you're seeing is compressed effort.
Hours of practice hidden behind a moment of fluency.
Years of exposure showing up all at once.
So it looks fast.
But it's actually consistent effort over time.
Here's a practical takeaway for listeners.
Start small but stay consistent.
Speak every day, even if it's just a few sentences.
Listen actively, not passively.
Imitate, don't just study.
And most importantly, don't fear mistakes.
Because mistakes are your fastest teacher.
Not your enemy.
Another takeaway, immerse yourself as much as possible.
Change your phone language, follow English content, think in English.
Create an environment where English is unavoidable.
That's when transformation happens.
Let's end with a powerful idea.
Language is not just communication, it's connection.
And when you learn a language,
You open doors to new people, cultures, and opportunities.